Joining us now on the line from the nation's capital, the economist Ahluwalia. She is chair of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Dr. Ahluwalia, it's good to meet you. How are you tonight?
Very well, thank you, Steve.
Glad to hear it. Let us just go back and do a bit of background before we talk about the Indian economy today. It, of course, has been, India, one of the fastest growing economies in the world over the last couple of decades. But going back to independence, and then I guess for a few decades after that, how would you describe economic growth at that time?
In the first 3 decades after independence, we really were stuck in a groove of about 3.5% per year growth of GDP. And it's only in the last 25 years that we've moved out of that and we've had an accelerating growth rate.
In fact, I think there was an expression called the Hindu rate of growth. When people said that, what did they mean?
Well, basically it was stuck to an anchor and wouldn't move. So derisively it was used as a constant Hindu rate of growth.
So what brought about the changes?
In the 1980s, there was this recognition that we were not going anywhere and we needed to make our policy instruments more market friendly and use the private sector to generate growth. And we went through a phase initially of domestic market orientation, but still keeping the economy closed to foreign competition. That came later. That came in the 1990s.
I guess there was a time, particularly when Indira Gandhi was prime minister and the economy was more closely aligned with the former Soviet Union, that it was very much state-controlled and not very open. What was it that eventually got her and successive prime ministers to change their minds on that?
See, basically we opted initially for a central planning model and we had a dominance of public sector, we had heavy regulation, closing the economy to foreign competition. But when all of that did not deliver rapid growth, then it was very clear that we needed to change our ways. And we started moving towards the market in a hesitant manner in the 1980s. And when we got very good results and the Hindu rate of growth began to move, and we got 5.5% per year growth on average during the 1980s, that really encouraged the policymakers to say that this was the way to go. And finally, in 1991, we decided to break with the past and start opening up the economy to imports and to foreign investment.
And how would you characterize the state of the economy over the past decade?
Terrific. In fact, I think while we started a process of economic reform in 1991, it took close to 10 years before the private sector in India began to believe that this was the course that the government was going to follow. And beginning with 2001, 2002, the private sector really began to put their money where their mouth was. And we have had a very rapid acceleration in our GDP growth, primarily driven by the private sector.
Now, here's a bit of an odd question, but of course, when people talk about the most dynamic and largest growing economies in the world over the past decade, they always talk China and India. Whose economy is better in your view?
You know, that's, I think, it's not the right question to ask.
I do that all the time.
These are two very different economies. You know, we are a free society, we are a democracy, we have a private sector which has always been there over the last 60 years. It has not just come up now. And we need to really negotiate our way through changes in policies. In India, you can't just have a change in policy by fiat, like in China you can. So these are two very different societies. In our economy, the changes have been carried forth by a number of different governments which are of different political complexions, but they have all moved in the direction of market orientation and opening up. So I think what you see in India is a very solid, durable process. It is not something that has been directed from above. This is what society wants. This is what the civil society has engaged in, and I think it has a more solid base.
Well, if I may say, that may not have been a very good question by me, but that was a very good answer by you. So thank you for that. Let's bring it to present day and talk about the projected rates of growth in India, given the current economic mess the world finds itself. Despite that, what are you looking at?
You know, in the last 5 years, our growth rate had moved up to close to 9% per annum on average, and we have now come down from that to 7% in the current year, which is going to end at the end of March, you know, in our fiscal year. So we have paid a price of a couple of percentage points because of our linkages with the rest of the world. The portfolio capital that had come out, that had come from outside has flown back. That has had its impact on India's growth. Then some of our export-oriented sectors have slowed down, and that has impacted. In the next year, the expectation is that this 7% may go down to somewhere between 6 and 6.5. But we hope that after that, the economy will bounce back. And during this period, the government is doing a lot of pump priming through infrastructure investment, etc. We've had 3 fiscal stimuli packages. So all that is being done to tide over the present problems.
Do you find it unusual that you're talking in terms of the economy bouncing back at 6.5%, 7% growth rates, which people, of course, in this country and to the south of us, you know, some of whom would give their eye teeth to see growth rates like that?
But don't forget, we still have a huge challenge of poverty facing our country. We have a quarter of our population which is below the poverty line, and if we need to meet their rising expectations of better standards of living, we can't afford to slip back, and there is tremendous opportunity. There's a rising middle class, there is a process of urbanization going on, investment climate improving, tremendous infrastructure opportunity. In fact, this should be the time when those investors who can't find anything to do in countries like yours should come to India and invest.
Okay, we hear you loud and clear. Having said that, if you are going to go from, say, 9 to 7 or 6.5% growth rates, even though that is strong relative to the rest of the world, there are sectors, obviously, that are going to be feeling the pinch. Which ones, for example?
Textiles have suffered because that's an export-oriented sector. Pharmaceuticals have suffered. Auto components, in which India is very strongly competitive globally with what is going on with the automotive sector, auto components are suffering. But the only hope is that in some of these sectors, with domestic demand being pushed up, we may be able to do some offsetting demand creation. The other factor is that agriculture has been doing well in recent years, and that also provides some resilience to growth in the economy.
I know economists like dealing in hard facts and hard numbers, so I run the risk here of asking a bit of a touchy-feely question. But, you know, in the West, you can almost sense the, I don't want to exaggerate this, but there is a fear out there. You know, am I going to lose my job tomorrow? My neighbor lost his job yesterday. Am I going to lose mine tomorrow? Is there that same fear in the air in India that things are about to come crashing down?
You know, we are used to living with hard realities. There are many people who find it difficult even to get their first job in India, even after being educated. And all this has really changed in the last 10 years, when if you were highly educated, you had no problem getting a terrific job. So now it means that the premium on those salaries may go down a little bit, but there is enough growth that I don't think that worries people so much. But there is a new class of young people who are coming up as entrepreneurs, especially after the IT development. I think that is giving them some hope that maybe they can start their own ventures. So it is really more about creating conditions in which private investment can really come out and create economic activity, and not just look for employment as such.
I appreciate that, but I think it's right to say that as recently as a decade and a half ago, literally half the Indian population lived in poverty, serious poverty. What's that number today?
It's about 25%.
And
it's still large.
It's large. Is it a stubborn 25%, or do you get the sense that there's progress being made?
No, there is progress being made. In fact, it was about 28% 5 years ago, and 25% is really an estimate, and we would know for sure when we have the next survey in a couple of years. But there's a clear downward trend.
And is that number going down because the Indian government has put conditions in place to allow it to happen, or because they have directly primed the pump or done the government spending required to make that happen?
No, I think this is really because we have had sustained growth with low inflation rates, and that has meant that there's been some trickle down to relieve the poor people. At the same time, there are direct programs of poverty alleviation for those who have not benefited from the growth process. And this is why today you have a lot of emphasis by policymakers on what we call inclusive growth, so that you try and spread basic education, basic health services, improve sanitation, and try to create processes of growth by which more and more people participate in this process. And that has become a very crucial aspect of policy, that we don't want growth for the sake of growth, but we want growth which is inclusive.
I appreciate that, but I gather there's still this sort of urban middle class that is doing relatively well, and a more traditional rural agricultural underclass, if you want to put it that way, that is still having difficulty coming up. How would you characterize that split?
There is less divergence today than earlier, because as I mentioned to you, agricultural growth has really picked up in the last 4 or 5 years, and inequality as we measure it is much less in India than in, say, China or Brazil. That doesn't mean that everybody is growing at the same rate. Growth is unequalizing, so there is some inequality, but I don't think the problem in India is so much inequality as it is really absolute poverty for a quarter of the population, which we have to work to get rid of.
And let me get a better understanding as well, and again, you'll forgive me, I'll make this comparison to China. They said that when the growth rates went from 11 or 12% in China to 7%, which is still high by our standards, however, they say it'll feel like a recession there. Will it be the same way in in India, where you go from, say, 9 to 6.5? Will it feel like a recession?
In India, we have had 3.5% growth for 3 decades, and then 5.5% for 2 decades, and we've had this 8 to 9% for about 5-6 years. So if we go back to, say, 6.5%, that still would be higher than what people were used to. So I don't think the impact is going to be as drastic, because we've not had a very long period of very rapid growth rate. That is not to say that any time you go down, it does feel bad. But I think we've not had very rapid growth for too long a time for it to make that much of a difference.
So in our last minute, what would you describe as the most persistent challenge facing the Indian economy today?
I would say, to my mind, infrastructure, particularly urban infrastructure, because we are going to see much more urbanization in the days to come because of rapid growth. And unlike China, we can't hold people back to certain areas, and we need to put our urban infrastructure in place. To me, that is a very major challenge.
Dr. Ahluwalia, I must say we've had many economists on this program, but none ever in a sorry. You're our first, and it's long overdue. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thank you.